turns out horses are kind of pain in the butt.
Still are.
Yeah. Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are starting the second hoofbeat of the book Hoofbeats. We are talking all about ancient horses and ancient humans and how we got along or sometimes didn't. But before we get into that today, we had a nice batch of lovely comments and reviews from people. One of them said that they found us and particularly liked our Small Things Forgotten episode. Or anyone who hasn't listened to it yet, that's a favorite of ours, a favorite book. We recommend checking that out. And it also talks a lot about cemeteries, which Barbara and I are always fans of.
Always.
We also received a book recommendation, so thank you for that. We always appreciate suggestions and people thinking about what we might enjoy. And for those horse enthusiasts out there, Barbara has a podcast to recommend to you.
Yes, so we had an opportunity to meet the host, Catherine, but if you really are into horses, check out her podcast, Horse Tales with Cat.
We had a lovely conversation with her and really look forward to maybe collaborating in the future too.
Yeah.
So without further ado, let's get into our chapters for this week. So this time there are only 2 chapters for us to cover, which is kind of a nice change up this time. We didn't have to read quite as much. And we, once again though, we don't really start off with horses. This book about horses has had a lot less horses than I anticipated.
I feel like we're getting there. We're getting there.
So this one starts off with wheels. And essentially what it's coming down to is that people first utilize these types of animals with sleds, I think, at the very first, and then wheels, as opposed to what we usually think of when we think of horses.
Right.
But yeah, this is a very interesting chapter, I noted, because it really highlights nicely what a world-altering innovation the wagon was.
Right. And we always hear, like, there's the old cliche about, invention of the wheel being really important. And this kind of does a really good job of highlighting why.
Right. It takes us beyond the cliche.
But would it have been as important if there were not animals to pull the cart? Mm-hmm. So I feel like the 4-legged critters that pull the carts are often not counted in that cliche, I guess.
Right.
I thought it was interesting too, because as you said, there's not a lot of horses yet, but it talks about how at first they were pulling these carts with bovine cows, whatever you want to call them. And then it moves into all the different types of donkeys, I guess, for a general term, even though some aren't donkeys.
Right.
I didn't realize there was, I know there's a lot of names for horses, but learning the different names of the different donkeys and donkey-related equids is a little overwhelming for me.
A lot more than I realized, for sure, yeah. I thought there were horses, donkeys, and zebras. And that's where it all stopped. But apparently, it's not that simple. Go figure.
But again, the author does a really good job of pointing out how well adapted the different donkey-related critters are for their specific environments. And I also really enjoyed the discussion on how you can see the difference in the skeletons of the animals once they start pulling the carts.
Yeah, and I felt like this clarified some of your questions last time, because you thought, well, they keep looking for bits, but, what if they use soft bits? What if they didn't use a bit? And this clarified how a lot of the skeletons and teeth would show different methods still, even with a soft bit.
Yeah.
That was very well done. But there was one in particular that was very unusual to me.
Yeah, the ring.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how it was, they could see it on the horse's teeth. So yeah, they put like a ring in the horse's lip and guided it that way. But then they learned it didn't work very well when you had multiple horses hitched, I guess. It wasn't enough control.
It didn't really work with horses at all.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It worked with oxen, cattle, and donkeys.
Yeah, but horses are just a little too wily, I guess.
Yeah, too fast and too quick to run.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess circling back briefly to the impact that this had on societies, like this, apparently a lot of this developed in the steppes between Europe and Asia. And so you have a lot of herders and not a lot of agriculture, but the herders were still pretty relegated to places that had, good amount of water.
Right.
There's a lot of those steppes they couldn't really access or subsist on, but the presence of the wheel allowed them to be much more mobile and actually carry stuff around and access those areas and move their herds further and such too, so they could actually access those things.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I hadn't really thought lot of the access to water
Hmm.
portion of it and how important that would be, which I know sounds silly now looking back on it, but it's just something that never really came into play in any conversations I've had, I guess. I don't know.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but how often in our lives have we had to worry about that?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense that we
Mhm.
wouldn't necessarily think about it as a priority either.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the different ways that we can actually spot some sort of control. Obviously, Barbara mentioned the lip rings. We get into that here? No, it's all just lip rings right now, basically.
Yeah, but there's also other tack that like the yokes and things like that to help attach the animal to the cart. And I guess some of that has been found in archaeological context.
Hmm. And when they're pulling a cart, it does leave marks on their skeleton
Yeah.
that we can actually see.
Yeah, either from like the equipment itself or in some cases like the overdevelopment of certain muscles used
Mhm.
to, pull the cart.
Right, just the pulling itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get just a little bit of a teaser into the next one because when they move to donkeys, they're a lot quicker than cattle are. And the heavy wagon that they'd been using, so the wheels at this time were like solid wood plank.
Right. Very clunky.
Not what we imagine for a spoked wheel.
Right.
No. And so very heavy. And so they actually moved towards more of a two-wheeled variety when they started using the donkeys and such.
Yeah. And even though the donkeys were more adapted for that environment, they need less water,
Mm-hmm.
like I guess better endurance, so to say, but they're not as strong as cattle, so they would have to use them in teams, I believe, right? Isn't that where that comes in?
Yeah, I think teams seem like the norm. Yeah.
But it was really interesting, I think, to just kind of see the evolution of how this all played out because I could see how people would view this as something very simple, like, oh, yeah, you just use a cart. But there's a lot that went into it because now you're not only trying to pull things, you're trying to control an animal as
Mhm.
well. So there's a lot
And
going on.
at the start, a wild animal.
Right. Yeah.
These are not domestic or they become domestic, but still somebody has to like take the initiative to try and work with a wild animal until they can be bred to be whatever you need it to be.
Right. And I thought it was interesting too is in this chapter they start to talk about when did they start riding these animals and they just talk
Mhm.
about it a little bit and early on they found some human burials where the pelvic region had some wear and tear and possibly like some injuries and stuff that you would expect to see in riders, but then they realized it was actually from sitting on the cart and like navigating the cart.
Mm.
And it was just because they were, like you said, the wheels were really clunky and it wasn't a smooth ride. And so sitting on those carts for long periods of time, I guess, had similar impact on the human skeleton as if you were riding.
And apparently there is some indication of riding, mostly through art, that is from those eras that show people riding on what looks like donkeys. But interestingly, they're not riding them where you picture us to ride an animal. They're actually riding them back on their
They're
rear hips, I guess.
Yeah, their haunches.
Yeah, and that is because the backs of the donkeys and such apparently were not strong enough to really hold the person over long term, and so they actually rode them further back for that purpose.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound very comfortable or easy to work with, and so I imagine it wasn't the most common thing unless you just really needed it or had a specific reason for it.
And to me, as someone who rides horses, the thought of riding back there, like we are taught from the very beginning, like leave the horse's haunches alone because that's how you can get a horse to spook or, not do what you want it to do. They don't like to be messed with back there. And so I was like, this goes against everything I believe in.
Yeah, we're talking about donkeys, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess I read too, because I was doing some research on this. Donkeys, when they quote spook, horses have a tendency to kind of run off a lot of times or do like a fun little spin or something.
Yeah.
Donkeys, they stop, like they pause. And that's, I guess, a behavioral difference in donkeys and horses. And there are saddles now. Obviously, this is more modern, but there are saddles that are made specifically for donkeys because they have like skeletal differences. You can't just throw a horse saddle on a donkey and be okay.
And so that's it for this chapter. Next, we'll finally get into people actually using horses, and it's not like you'd expect it to be. But first, if you have a coworker or friend with a daily commute who likes history, archaeology, and possibly horses, send them this episode. It's an easy listen for a drive. Chapter 5, the last chapter for this episode today. My first note is finally horses.
We made it.
We made it. It's kind of been teased at us the whole way. We definitely have talked about horses, but it's mostly talking around why they're not using horses yet so far.
Right.
Or how we thought they were using horses here and they're not. But now they are. So, yes, so people finally are starting to use horses, and you might think, well, why did it take them so long? And it turns out horses are kind of pain in the butt.
Still are.
Yeah. Apparently they're even worse than they were now. Because, like Barbara mentioned when we were talking about the last chapter, they are runners. If there's a threat, they run away or they fight. They're faster than the other animals that humans are working with, and they tend to be quicker to react. Also, remember last episode, we had a whole bunch of talk about how much humans hunted and killed them. And we have been the only serious predator they've ever really had.
Right. So now we have generations of horses who have become accustomed to running from us.
And we have some stupid human that probably jumps on its back at one point, right? And that's not going to go well. They don't like that.
Right.
So it doesn't start with riding on their backs like we would picture with horses. It's a natural transition from the previous chapter, actually, where it starts with carts or carts that develop to be specifically for horses. So once again, even more than donkeys, the heavy carts and stuff that they had were just too darn heavy for horses and unmaneuverable. And so they shifted towards much lighter maneuverable carts that in this case we're calling chariots.
Right.
I usually think of a chariot as a war machine, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about here today, though it is a lot of what it is.
Yeah, it did evolve towards that.
Yeah, not surprising. Yeah, and then I was interested to hear them talking about, there's a whole section on overcoming aggression for the horses. I don't think of a horse as aggressive. I kick, but it's usually like a, get away from me or an instant thing. Not like when I hear aggression, I think like it's going after you, trying to trample you or something.
I mean, it's so hard to say because now horses are so domesticated, but I mean, I've run into horses that have been just downright mean. I've been bitten, kicked. I've had a horse, essentially, it was a stallion at the time, kind of bulldozed me there. It ran into me with its chest, and it really literally seemed like it was for the express purpose of just mowing me over and expressing dominance. So they can be aggressive, but I think a lot of that aggression comes from fear, which kind of makes sense with what we were saying previously about being a hunted animal by us. We were their predator.
And you're right that this is definitely a different animal that we have today.
Yeah. But I do think it's interesting because they kind of engineered the chariots or the carts to use the horse's panic and its herd mentality to their advantage, right? The cart behind it kind of made it naturally want to move forward away from the cart. They're herd animals, so putting, numerous horses on the driving team helped to soothe each other. And so I feel like they used a lot of those behaviors that we might not think of as beneficial to their advantage in the design of the cart itself.
Yeah, and also importantly, the nose ring or lip ring method is not really effective for horses. They're too flighty, essentially. And so humans have to come up with other ways of controlling them. Pairing them up was one tactic, but this is also where we start to see more complicated steering methods that we expect to see today with bridles and bits and that kind of a thing. This is where we do learn that some of the earliest bits were actually pretty organic.
Yeah.
And essentially a horse could bite through them. But interestingly enough, I was surprised to hear that they still left marks on the enamel that we can see.
Yeah, that was, I guess, if you're using it every day, the wear is eventually going to be there.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Also, there's a groove on the nose from halters and stuff that develops.
Which you can see, I mean, even in today's horses, you can kind of see that. And I've seen people talk about that in regards to wild horses, like the wild Mustang. And sometimes you can tell if it's wild or not because it'll have the little groove or not.
Interesting, yeah.
Oh, I did like the discussion on zebras and how ornery they are.
Yeah.
That was just kind of funny. This is it was kind of a side note, but talking about how zebras have never really successfully been, quote, domesticated. And a lot of people are like, why? And I guess he was just explaining in the book that many times people have tried, even up through the modern era, the United States and other Western powers, when they were, colonizing Africa and exploiting it, essentially, they tried to use zebras and it didn't work out. And then I guess one was given as a gift gift to President Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
His name was Dan, and it was supposed to be part of like a breeding program, and it didn't work out. Dan did not oblige.
No, I think this was part of it was to illustrate modern historic examples of how some of the equids, as we call them, are really not easily suited towards this kind of work, and leading that into like how difficult horses were to work with, especially when they were wild.
Yeah, and like we went with horses instead of zebras.
Right.
You know.
Well, that could have been a bit of location too.
Yeah. Oh,
but
yeah.
regardless, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We still go with horses instead of zebras. So just for reference for everybody, at this point, we're talking about 3000 to 2000 BC when this is actually going on right now with the domestication of horses, which is wild to think about. You know, in recorded ancient history, there were periods where horses were just not a thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like we're talking, you know, Egyptian times, Babylonian times, apparently horses were not there.
Yeah, that is true. Now that
Right?
you're saying that, I'm like, wait.
And that's just wild to think
Yeah,
about.
because
And
I always think of like a lot of those early cultures in my mind. I guess I'm kind of confusing them with like Romans, you know, and the chariots and the battle with horses. And yeah, that's crazy.
And we might have seen examples of, you know, depictions of these times, and there may have been horses in there because the people doing those depictions didn't know any different.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting, kind of had a little mental shift, like, oh, it's not been around that long in human history. Like, you know, dogs in their 10 to 20,000 years or more, right? As opposed to horses, they're kind of the new kids on the block in some ways. But when they do kick off, they really start to kick off. In particular, there's one called the Syntasha culture. They actually started to develop a whole bunch of specialized equipment, including the first bridle and bit, a better braking system with the bridle noseband. Is that something that's done in carts today still?
I'm not very familiar with carting, but if anybody is, let us know.
My understanding was it forces the head down, which forces the horse to stop.
Yeah.
And then we actually finally get spoked wheels as well, which is lighter and faster and allows for horses to use their full ability, essentially. So it really seemed to kind of, once we had them, like, boy, this is important. We're going to invest some real time and energy into developing technology for them. You know, we're talking still probably hundreds of years, but still.
Innovative for the time.
That's pretty quick for historic periods.
What I found interesting, and I guess the book kind of hinted at this early on too, and I know we've talked about it in our previous book, but, you know, obviously horses were used for meat. That's how we started using them to begin with. But even after we started using them as transport, we still utilized those products, the meat and also the milk, which I'm still blown away by this. It became a really, really important component of diets from everywhere from like Mongolia to Ukraine, which makes sense, especially in those areas where you have limited nutritional resources, right? But never in my life have I heard of anybody drinking horse milk.
I think I've heard of some Middle East cultures that did.
Yeah. I mean, historically, and I know we learned about it in our past book, but it's just fascinating to me. And like I said, I want to know who's milking these horses and what that's like.
Also interesting, I thought, was at the time, especially, most of the people were lactose intolerant as adults.
Yeah.
And so to make the milk so people could eat it, they actually fermented it.
Right.
And the fermentation process, it not only allowed them to eat it, but it also improved the nutritional value of it as well. And this is something that we learned quite a bit about in ancient brews. That is why brewing was so important, at least initially before people were using it to get drunk, is because it actually dramatically improved the nutritional value of foods if it was partially fermented before it was eaten. So that all lined up very nicely. I thought that was kind of cool. Wasn't there one that used milk in that book?
I don't remember milk. I remember bread.
Yeah.
I know in our previous book, we talked about the fermented milk from horses.
That is what we talked about. Yes. I forget which culture that was right now, though. Oh, that was, it was one of the Eastern steppe cultures.
Yes. And I can't remember which one because there were several.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up and I'll add a link to that one as well. Yes. So we have talked about this a couple times before. We do also talk about the Akkadians once again.
Yes.
They were the first ones to really, really weaponize the chariot and turn it into like a war position. And then Egypt adapted that pretty quickly too, but also they had problems of keeping enough horses and raising enough horses because their environment was different enough that they didn't do too well there. So they became kind of a prestigious animal.
But the whole evolution from the cart with the heavy wheels and how the cart changed, which allowed for more maneuverability, which was necessary for the horse. It's really interesting to see how all of that kind of comes together to create this really, really impressive battle culture that utilizes horses.
Yeah, and I was thinking too about how, well, if your wheel is just a few boards hammered together, that's pretty easy to build and maintain. A spoked wheel is a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
And so that really speaks to the importance of horses to people, that not only would they invest the time into developing something like that, but also keep producing it. Also, we have a number of indications that early adapters of the chariot were like major destructive forces on cultures that hadn't yet. Babylon, what kind of got clobbered a couple times. Egypt got clobbered.
Yeah, Egypt.
And there was an Eastern culture. The Indus Valley. There's some hypotheses that the Indus Valley may have gotten hammered by another culture that was chariot. That one I think didn't hold up, but it was interesting to see the Indus Valley show up again as well. But with that, I think we have finished up this episode and talking about horses and chariots. I think next time we finally get into people riding horses.
Yay! I'm so excited.
It's taken longer than I anticipated.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear what they have to say about that. I'm sure y'all will be getting a lot of commentary from me.
I'm very interested in the development of horse technology.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know, for example, that stirrups came actually not that long ago.
Right.
And that was a huge deal.
I'm just thankful for the saddle.
Saddle, at this point, if they're riding any of these animals, they're not using anything really as a saddle.
Yeah.
Just kind of a pad, essentially. So, yeah. And so that is something I'm looking forward to talking about next episode. And you can join us next time to hear all about it. So we'll see you then.
Happy reading, everybody.